Welcome to the Fear Files channel. Today we will dive into one of the most mysterious and frightening stories of the 20th century. The story of how the opening of an ancient tomb led to the greatest tragedy in the history of mankind. This is a story about the curse of Tamerlane, about that fateful day in June 1941, when Soviet archaeologists penetrated the tomb of the great conqueror and about what followed. Sit back, turn off the lights, and let me tell you this chilling story. Samarkand, June 1941. The hot Central Asian sun mercilessly scorches the ancient city, which was once the capital of a huge empire. In the center of the city rises the majestic mausoleum of Gurumir, the tomb of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. This man conquered half of the known world in the 14th century. His name inspired terror from India to the Mediterranean Sea. His empire stretched over millions of square kilometers, and the number of victims of his conquests was in the millions. And now, more than 500 years after his death, a group of Soviet scientists is preparing to disturb his eternal peace. The expedition was led by the famous anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov, a specialist in restoring the appearance of people from their skulls. He had a team of archaeologists, historians, and workers with him. Their task was to open the tomb, examine the remains of the great conqueror, and scientifically confirm that it was here that Tamerlane rested. It would seem to be an ordinary archaeological expedition, of which dozens were carried out in the Soviet Union. But the locals were in a completely different mood. From the very beginning of the work, Uzbek elders warned scientists about the ancient curse. They said that a warning was inscribed on Tamerlane's tomb: "When I rise from the dead, the world will tremble." Another version of the inscription read, "Whoever opens my tomb will unleash a spirit of war more terrible than I." The old people begged not to touch the sacred place, told ancient legends that the one who disturbed the ashes of the great emir would bring terrible trouble on his people. But Soviet scientists were materialists. They did not believe in superstitions and curses. For them, these were only remnants of the dark past, which they needed to get rid of. On June 21st, 1941, exactly at noon, the massive jade slab that covered the entrance to the crypt was raised. As workers pushed back the slab, which weighed several hundred kilograms, a chill wafted from the darkness of the tomb that witnesses said was unnatural for a hot summer day. One of the Uzbek workers who participated in the autopsy turned gray on the spot and refused to continue working. He insisted that he had seen something dark, like smoke or shadow, burst out of the tomb and rush north. Of course, scientists explained this by the play of light and shadow, the evaporation of gases accumulated over the centuries. But superstitious fear had already spread among the local population. Gerasimov and his team descended into the crypt. A picture appeared before them, untouched for centuries. In the center of the tomb stood a massive sarcophagus made of dark green jade. It was one of the largest jade monoliths in the world, mined, according to legends, in the Pamir Mountains and brought to Samarkand with incredible efforts. The sarcophagus was covered with Arabic script, quotes from the Quran, and praises to Allah. Archaeologists began to take photographs, take measurements, and make descriptions. The atmosphere in the tomb was oppressive. Many members of the expedition noted an inexplicable feeling of anxiety and fear. In the evening of the same day, when the work was suspended until the next morning, strange things began to happen. Several workers refused to go to work, citing bad dreams and forebodings. The local mullah came to the leadership of the expedition and with tears in his eyes begged them to stop the work seal the tomb back, and conduct purifying prayers. He claimed that he could not sleep all night, sensing the presence of something evil and powerful that had been awakened. But the scientific expedition continued its work. On June 22, 1941, at 4 o'clock in the morning, as Gerasimov and his colleagues slept in their tents near the mausoleum, something that would change the course of history forever began. At that moment, without declaring war, German troops crossed the border of the Soviet Union. The Great Patriotic War began, the bloodiest war in the history of mankind, which would take the lives of more than 27 million Soviet citizens. Coincidence? A simple coincidence? Or has the ancient curse really come true? When at dawn on June 22nd, the first confused reports of the beginning of the war reached the expedition, many of the local workers fled in terror. They were sure that this was the punishment for the desecration of the tomb. The elders said, "We warned you. You have awakened the spirit of war, and now blood will be shed like a river." The war began, and the whole country mobilized to fight the invaders. However, Gerasimov received an order to continue his work. The study of Tamerlane's remains had not only scientific, but also ideological significance. The Soviet government wanted to prove that it could study and learn about the past without fear of any superstitions and curses. And so, while the catastrophe was unfolding on the western borders of the Soviet Union, the opening of the ancient tomb continued in Samarkand. When the lid of the sarcophagus was finally lifted, the remains were presented to the scientists, wrapped in decayed cloth. As Gerasimov carefully unfolded the shrouds, it became clear that Tamerlane was indeed in front of them. The skeleton belonged to a man who was tall for his time, about 170 centimeters. The right leg was shorter than the left and had signs of serious injury. This coincided with historical evidence that Tamerlane limped after being wounded by an arrow in his youth. Hence his nickname, Tamerlane, which means Timur the Lame, which the Europeans distorted into Tamerlane. But the most striking discovery was the condition of the skull. When Gerasimov began to study it, he found traces indicating features mixed with Caucasoid. The scientist began his famous method of reconstructing the face from the skull. For several weeks, while bloody battles were going on the fronts, Gerasimov worked in the evenings to restore the image of the great conqueror. And when the work was completed, a face appeared before the astonished audience that no one living for more than 500 years had seen. Tamerlane's face turned out to be stern, strong-willed, with high cheekbones and a piercing look of empty eye sockets, which the reenactor tried to convey in his work. It was the face of a man who knew no pity, who had seen the death of millions and remained unperturbed. According to Gerasimov himself, while working on this face, he experienced a strange feeling as if a dead conqueror was watching him, evaluating his work. Several times the scientist woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, after nightmares in which he saw endless battlefields, mountains of corpses and rivers of blood. Meanwhile, a catastrophe was unfolding at the front. German troops were rapidly advancing deep into Soviet territory. Minsk fell, Kiev was surrounded, the enemy was rushing to Moscow and Leningrad. The losses were monstrous, hundreds of thousands of killed, wounded, and captured. It seemed that nothing could stop the German war machine. And all this time in Samarkand lay the uncovered remains of a man who, 600 years ago, was himself the personification of war and destruction. Local residents had no doubt about the connection between these events. There were rumors in Samarkand that at night strange lights were seen over the mausoleum, sounds similar to moans or the distant clang of weapons were heard. It was said that the spirit of Tamerlane had broken free and was now leading the armies of the enemy against the Russians, avenging the disturbed peace. Of course, from a scientific point of view, it was absurd, but the coincidence was too creepy. The tomb was opened on June 21st, and on June 22nd, the most terrible war in history began. There is a documented fact. In September 1941, when the situation on the fronts became critical, several high-ranking officials from Uzbekistan turned to Stalin. They conveyed the words of local elders and spiritual leaders that the war would not end until the remains of Tamerlane were returned to their place in compliance with all rituals. Surprisingly, Stalin, known for his materialism and atheism, took this message seriously. Perhaps, in the desperate situation of the first months of the war, even such a pragmatist as Stalin was ready to try anything. The order was given. In November 1941, when the Germans stood at the gates of Moscow, the remains of Tamerlane were returned to the mausoleum with honors. The reburial ceremony was conducted by Muslim clerics according to all the rules of the Islamic funeral rite. Prayers were read, asking the spirit of the great Emir for forgiveness for the trouble. The tomb was sealed and special purification rituals were performed over it. And here another terrible coincidence occurs. Just a few days after the reburial, Soviet troops launched a counteroffensive near Moscow. This was the first major defeat of the German army in World War II. The offensive, which seemed invincible, was stopped. The Germans were thrown back from the capital. Of course, historians explain this by a variety of rational reasons. Fresh Siberian divisions pulled up, severe frost struck, German communications were stretched. But the coincidence in time with the reburial of Tamerlane again makes you think. Moreover, there is evidence that at the most critical moments of the war, people came to the grave of Tamerlane and prayed for victory. In 1942, when the Battle of Stalingrad was underway, a delegation was sent from Moscow to Samarkand on an order with a special task. They were supposed to hold special ceremonies at the mausoleum, calling on the spirit of the great warrior to help in the fight against the invaders. It is said that after that, Stalingrad held out, and it was there that the great offensive began, which eventually led to victory. But let's go back to Tamerlane himself to understand why his curse could be so terrible. Who was this man whose tomb was so dangerous? Timur was born in 1336 in a small Uzbek village near Samarkand. He was not a Genghis Khan, did not belong to the Genghis Khan family, which at that time was the most important factor in the legitimacy of power in Central Asia. But thanks to exceptional military talent, cunning, and absolute ruthlessness, he was able to rise from a petty military commander to the ruler of a huge empire. His conquest began in the 60s of the 14th century and continued until his death in 1405. During these 40-odd years, Tamerlane conquered a territory comparable to the empire of Alexander the Great. He defeated the Golden Horde, destroyed many cities in Russia, conquered Persia, Iraq, Syria, invaded India, where he took Delhi and staged a monstrous massacre. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara, capturing him. Tamerlane planned a campaign against China, but death overtook him on the way. Tamerlane's methods were horrific even for the brutal 14th century. After the capture of the cities that resisted, he ordered the massacre of the entire population. His armies built pyramids of severed heads. This was his calling card, a warning to everyone who dared to resist. In some cities, the death toll was in the hundreds of thousands. Historians debate the exact figures, but the total number of victims of his conquests is estimated to be between 5 and 17 million people, an astronomical figure at a time when the world population was many times smaller than it is today. At the same time, Tamerlane was not just a bloodthirsty barbarian. He patronized the sciences and arts, turned Samarkand into one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The best architects, scientists, and poets worked at his court. He collected a huge library, was interested in astronomy and history. But this love of beauty was strangely combined with absolute cruelty in war. It was said that he could talk for hours with scientists about the intricacies of philosophy, and the next day he would coolly watch the mass executions. There are many legends about Tamerlane's supernatural abilities. It was said that he could foresee the future, that the spirits of his ancestors helped him in battles, that he made a pact with dark forces for power and victories. Of course, these are legends, but they reflect the impression that this man made on his contemporaries. He was so feared that even after his death, his name was used as a threat to naughty children. If you misbehave, Tamerlane will come. When Tamerlane died in early 1405, his body was taken to Samarkand and buried in the Gurmir mausoleum with unprecedented pomp. Over his grave, the same massive jade sarcophagus was installed. According to legend, Tamerlane himself, before his death, ordered to inscribe on the tomb a warning to descendants not to disturb his ashes. He said he left a spirit of war in his tomb that would sleep until he was awakened. And if someone dares to open the tomb, this spirit will break out and bring as many deaths as Tamerlane himself brought during his lifetime. This legend has been passed down from generation to generation. For centuries, the locals revered the mausoleum, but never tried to get inside the sarcophagus. Even when Samarkand became part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, no one dared to disturb the remains. Local authorities respected the feelings of the population and did not allow any archaeological work in the mausoleum. Everything changed after the revolution. The Soviet government pursued a policy of militant atheism. Religious monuments were considered as objects for scientific study and not as sacred places. In the 30s, a large program of archaeological research began throughout the country, including Central Asia. And in 1941, the turn came to the tomb of Tamerlane. Interestingly, the timing of the opening of the tomb seems particularly ominous. June 1941 is the day before the start of the greatest war in history. Of course, scientists could not have known about Hitler's plans. But doesn't it seem strange that it was at this moment that it was decided to disturb the ashes of the greatest conqueror? Some researchers of paranormal phenomena believe that this is not a coincidence, but a manifestation of some kind of dark synchronicity when events are mysteriously attracted to each other. There is another little-known fact that makes this story even more creepy. According to the memoirs of one of the members of the expedition, when the tomb was opened, something really escaped from it. It wasn't just air or vapor. Eyewitnesses described it as a dark cloud or fog that rose from the crypt and slowly dissipated into the air. Several people claimed that in this fog, it was possible to distinguish an outline reminiscent of galloping horsemen with weapons. Of course, this can be attributed to the imagination of frightened, superstitious people. But all these witnesses independently described the same thing. Moreover, within a few days after the tomb was opened, several members of the expedition felt ill. They were tormented by nightmares, headaches, an unreasonable feeling of fear and anxiety. One of the Uzbek workers died a week after the autopsy under mysterious circumstances. He was found dead in his bed with no visible signs of violence or disease. The locals said that he was killed by a spirit enraged by the desecration of the sacred place. The official version said that the cause of death was a heart attack, but doctors could not explain why the heart of a young, healthy man suddenly failed. There were other strange incidents. One of the archaeologists, who worked directly with the remains, went to the front a few months later and died in the first battle under strange circumstances. He was killed by a stray bullet that ricocheted off the stone and hit him right in the heart. Another member of the expedition went mad and spent the rest of the war in a mental hospital, raving about the ghosts of warriors and endless battles. Of course, all this can be explained by wartime stress, but there were too many coincidences. Mikhail Gerasimov himself, who led the opening of the tomb, lived until 1970 and became an outstanding scientist. He never spoke publicly about the curse, but in private conversations he admitted that working with the remains of Tamerlane was the hardest in his career. Not physically, but psychologically. He said that all the time he felt someone's gaze on him, that at night he was haunted by visions of war and destruction. After completing work on the reconstruction of Tamerlane's face, Gerasimov admitted to colleagues that he never wanted to deal with these remains again. Now, let's look at history from the other side. Skeptics rightly point out that the connection between the opening of the tomb and the outbreak of war is a classic manifestation of the effect of post-factum rationalization. That is, people are looking for explanations for tragic events and find them where there are none. The outbreak of war was the result of geopolitical processes, the planning of the German command, and strategic decisions. An archaeological expedition in distant Samarkand could not have influenced these events in any way. Also, the coincidence of dates, while striking, is not so statistically unbelievable. After all, dozens of archaeological expeditions are conducted per year, and some of them will inevitably fall on the dates of some significant events. If the war had begun in a month, no one would have connected it with the opening of the tomb. The human brain is designed in such a way that it looks for patterns and connections even where there are none. This is called apophenia. As for the reburial and the subsequent turn in the war, there are also rational explanations. By November-December 1941, the German offensive had run out of steam for a variety of reasons. Overstretched communications, the onset of winter, and the arrival of fresh Soviet reserves from Siberia and the Far East after intelligence reported that Japan had no plans to attack the USSR. The counteroffensive near Moscow was carefully prepared and was the result of military planning, not mystical ceremonies in Samarkand. However, there is something that casts doubt on the completely skeptical approach. The very fact that Stalin ordered the reburial of the remains speaks volumes. Stalin was the ultimate rationalist and pragmatist. He despised religion and superstition. And yet, at a critical moment in the war, when every decision could mean the difference between victory and defeat, he devoted resources to a religious ceremony for the reburial of a medieval conqueror. Why? Some researchers believe that Stalin did not believe in the curse as such, but understood its psychological impact. If millions of people in Central Asia believe that the war began because of the opening of the tomb, then the reburial of the remains can raise their morale, strengthen faith in victory. It would be a purely practical, psychological operation using the superstitions of the people for political purposes. But there is another version, more mystical. What if Stalin received some information that made him take the curse seriously? In the NKVD, There were special departments engaged in paranormal research. This is not science fiction. Documents about this are partially declassified. The Soviet Special Services studied the possibility of using psychics, telepathy, and conducted experiments with altered states of consciousness. What if one of these people told Stalin that the threat from Tamerlane's disturbed spirit was real? There's a classified report that is being talked about in narrow circles of paranormal researchers. Allegedly, in September 1941, a group of psychics at the NKVD held a session trying to find out the reasons for such a catastrophic start of the war. Mediums fell into a trance and began to speak an ancient Turkic language, which they did not know. When their words were translated, they turned out to be threats and curses in the name of Tamerlane, who promised to destroy those who disturbed his peace. One of the mediums died during the seance from cardiac arrest. His last words were, "He's coming." Of course, this report has never been officially confirmed, but rumors about it are still circulating. Let's look at another aspect of this story: cultural and psychological. For the peoples of Central Asia, Tamerlane is a complex and contradictory figure. On the one hand, he is a cruel conqueror, flooding half the world with blood. On the other hand, he was a great ruler, under whom Samarkand reached unprecedented prosperity, became a center of science, culture, and trade. In the people's memory, he remained as a powerful Khan, whose will was adamant, whose revenge was terrible, but who could also be just and generous to those who served him. Legends about Tamerlane have been passed down from generation to generation. It was said that before he died, he gathered his retinue and said, "My flesh will die, but my spirit will remain. I will guard this city and these lands. As long as my tomb is intact, the people will be protected. But if anyone dares to disturb my ashes, I will come again, not as a protector, but as a punisher. I will unleash such a storm of war on the world that the heavens will tremble." In this context, the opening of the tomb was not just an archaeological operation. For believers, this was a desecration of sacred place, a violation of an ancient agreement between the ruler and the people. This was an insult to the spirit of the great ancestor. And the punishment followed immediately. A few hours later, the war began, which brought incalculable suffering. It is interesting to note that similar stories of tomb curses exist in many cultures. The most famous is, of course, the curse of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922. After the opening of the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh, members of the expedition began to die under mysterious circumstances. Lord Carnarvon, who financed the excavation, died a few months later from an infection. Others followed. In just 10 years, more than 20 people died, one way or another connected with the opening of the tomb. Of course, scientists attribute this to spore fungi and bacteria that have been preserved in sealed tombs for thousands of years and have become deadly to people who have no immunity to them. But even these scientific explanations do not negate the fact the ancient tomb builders knew what they were doing when they warned of curses. Perhaps they knew about disease-causing organisms and used the idea of a curse as a way to protect the burial site. Or maybe there really are forces that we do not understand, and some places are better left untouched. In the case of Tamerlane, the scale of the tragedy was incomparably greater. If several dozen people suffered from the curse of Tutankhamun, then the war that began after the opening of Tamerlane's tomb claimed tens of millions of lives. It was the bloodiest war in the history of mankind. Is it possible to compare the scale of the personality of Tamerlane, a conqueror whose empire stretched for thousands of kilometers, and the young Tutankhamun, who died at the age of 18 without having performed great deeds. Perhaps the power of the curse corresponds to the power and significance of the one who cast it. There's one more curious point. In November 1942, during the Battle of Stalingrad, something strange happened. A group of German soldiers who broke through to the Volga seized the museum, where, among other exhibits, photographs of the reconstructed face of Tamerlane and some artifact from the Gurmir mausoleum, taken out before reburial, were kept. The Germans began looting the museum, and one of the officers, an amateur archaeologist, took several items, including a photograph of the reenactment. 3 days later, his unit was surrounded and completely destroyed. This officer was found dead in the basement of a destroyed building. The body had no wounds, but the face was distorted into a grimace of horror. The eyes were wide open, staring into the void. A photo of Tamerlane lay next to him. Isn't this a manifestation of a curse? The enemy, who encroached on the artifacts associated with the great emir, was destroyed. Local residents, having learned about this, only shook their heads. The spirit of Tamerlane does not forgive. But here we again enter the area where history ends and legends begin. After the reburial, and until the end of the war, no further attempts were made to open the tomb. The Gurmir mausoleum became a place that was guarded especially carefully. It is said that several times high-ranking officials from Moscow came there, who spent hours at the tomb, praying or meditating about something. There are no official records of this, but everyone in Samarkand knew about it. After the war, the restoration of the destroyed mausoleum began. During the war, it suffered from bombing. The work was carried out with the greatest care. Under no circumstances did anyone try to open the sarcophagus again. The restorers worked only on the exterior design, strengthened the walls, restored the mosaics. And as soon as the work was completed, the mausoleum began to be guarded even more strictly. In the post-war years, the story of Tamerlane's curse became widely known, although it was not officially talked about. Soviet propaganda did not recognize mystical explanations. Everything was explained materialistically. But among the people, especially in Central Asia, no one doubted the reality of the curse. War veterans who returned home to Uzbekistan came to the mausoleum and thanked the spirit of Tamerlane for finally helping to defeat the enemy after his ashes were returned to the place with honor. There was even an unofficial tradition. Before important undertakings, especially military or state, to come to the mausoleum and ask the spirit of the great emir for a blessing. No one officially acknowledged it, but everyone knew it. During the Cold War, they say before particularly tense periods of relations with the West, someone from the high leadership always visited Samarkand. In the 60s, there was another attempt to explore the tomb. A group of scientists received permission to conduct non-invasive studies using new technologies, X-ray, ultrasound. They were strictly forbidden to open the sarcophagus, but it was possible to scan its contents. The work began, and problems began immediately. The equipment was constantly failing for no apparent reason. Photographic films were illuminated, showing strange blurry images that some interpreted as ghostly figures. Several members of the expedition fell ill with an incomprehensible fever. The project manager eventually decided to stop the work, citing technical difficulties. But his colleagues knew he was just scared, and there was something to be afraid of. Now let's move to our time. In the 90s, after the collapse of the USSR, Uzbekistan became an independent state. Tamerlane was declared a national hero, a symbol of the greatness of the Uzbek people. His image appeared on banknotes. Monuments to him were erected throughout the country. The Reburial Mausoleum has become one of the main tourist attractions, a place of pilgrimage not only for Uzbeks, but also for people from all over the world interested in history and mysticism. But even in modern times, no one dares to disturb the sarcophagus. Several times there have been proposals from Western universities to conduct modern studies of the remains using the latest technologies, genetic analysis, isotope analysis, three-dimensional scanning. All these offers were politely declined. The official reason is respect for the memory of ancestors and cultural traditions. Unofficial, no one wants to take risks. The story of 1941 is too well remembered. There's an interesting detail that few people know about. In 2001, shortly before the events of September 11th, a group of American tourists visited the mausoleum. One of them, an amateur archaeologist, tried to touch the sarcophagus despite the prohibitions. The guards immediately took him out of the mausoleum, and the locals were furious. It was said that he had desecrated the sacred place. 2 months later, the September 11th attacks took place, and the war in Afghanistan began, which continues in one form or another to this day. Just a coincidence? Or another manifestation of an ancient curse? Some paranormal researchers put forward a theory that Tamerlane's tomb is not just a burial place, but a kind of seal that seals some dark energy or entity. As long as the seal is not broken, this energy sleeps. But if it is disturbed, it bursts out, bringing chaos and war. In this context, the curse is not the revenge of the spirit of the deceased conqueror, but a warning of the real danger posed by opening the tomb. This theory finds unexpected support in ancient texts. Some medieval Persian chronicles say that Tamerlane, before his death, ordered his sages and magicians to perform a special ritual over his grave. This ritual was supposed to seal the war, to bind the spirit of war to his body so that after his death the world would have a respite from endless conflicts. But the ritual only worked as long as the body remained intact. Breaking the grave meant breaking the seal and liberating the spirit of war. Can we believe these ancient texts? From a rational point of view, it is unlikely. This is rather a poetic understanding of the personality of Tamerlane and his influence on history. But on the other hand, ancient cultures often possessed knowledge that we are only beginning to understand. Perhaps they knew something about the nature of reality, about the connections between the material and spiritual worlds, which modern science does not yet suspect. In recent years, another version of events has emerged based on quantum physics and information field theory. According to this hypothesis, outstanding personalities, especially those who have had a huge impact on the fate of millions of people, leave behind not only material traces, but also a kind of information imprint in the structure of space-time. This imprint is associated with the place of their burial. When the burial place of such a person is disturbed, it creates a resonance in the information field, which can manifest in the physical world through synchronistic events. Sounds like science fiction? It's possible, but it is worth remembering that many phenomena that were previously considered mysticism have now received a scientific explanation. Who knows? Maybe in 50 or 100 years, we will have instruments capable of measuring and studying these information fields. And then we will be able to understand what really happened in June 1941. In the meantime, the Reburial Mausoleum stands in the center of Samarkand, majestic and silent. Its turquoise dome is visible from afar, serving as a reminder of past greatness and secrets that are best left undisturbed. Thousands of tourists visit it every year, take pictures against the background of the ancient walls, read information plates about the great conqueror. But only a few know the full story of what happened here in the fateful June of 1941. Local residents still treat the mausoleum with special respect. The old people tell their grandchildren the story of the curse, passing it on to the next generations. This is not just a scary fairy tale for them. It is part of their history, their identity, their understanding of the world, where the material and the spiritual are inextricably intertwined. And we return to the main question: was it a curse or a coincidence? From a scientific, rational point of view, of course, it was a coincidence. The beginning of the Great Patriotic War was the result of political, economic, and ideological factors. The Barbarossa Plan was developed for months. The date of the attack was chosen for military strategic reasons. The archaeological expedition in Samarkand could not in any way influence the decisions made in Berlin. But there are things that science cannot yet explain. A striking coincidence of dates. The rapid deterioration of the situation at the front immediately after the opening of the tomb. An equally rapid improvement after reburial. Strange incidents with people who dealt with the remains. Thousand-year-old legends that turned out to be prophetic. All of this can be explained by selective perception, confirmatory displacement, apophenia, psychological effects, where we see connections where there are none. But what if there really are connections in this case? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. There may not be a literal curse in the form of an evil spirit or a vengeful ghost, but there is something more subtle: the collective unconscious information field's quantum entanglement of events. By disturbing the remains of a man whose life was devoted to war and conquest, whose name inspired fear for centuries, we may have activated some archetype of war in the collective unconscious of humanity. And this archetype manifested itself in the form of the greatest conflict in history. Or maybe the warnings inscribed on the tomb were based on a deep understanding of human nature. The ancients knew that after disturbing the ashes of a great warrior, people would involuntarily begin to think about war, conflicts, strength, and power. These thoughts spread, create a certain atmosphere, which, in the end, materializes into real events. A curse works because people believe in it, and this belief changes their behavior, their decisions, their fate. Be that as it may, the story of the curse of Tamerlane's tomb remains one of the most fascinating and frightening stories of the 20th century. It reminds us that the world is more complex and mysterious than it seems. That ancient cultures knew something that we have forgotten or have not yet discovered. That there are places and things that need to be treated with respect and care, even if we don't understand why. And it reminds us of the price of curiosity. Was it worth opening the tomb? What did we get in return? Scientific data, facial reconstruction, confirmation of historical facts. All this is valuable for science. But if there is even the slightest possibility that this action contributed to the outbreak of a war that claimed millions of lives, the price was prohibitive. Of course, I am not calling for the abandonment of science and archaeological research. The study of the past is important and necessary. But perhaps we should be more attentive to the warnings of the ancients, to local traditions and beliefs. Not everything can be explained by modern science, and our ignorance does not mean that there is no cause for concern. In our time, when the world is again balancing on the brink of major conflicts, when the international situation is tense and the nuclear threat is more real than ever, the story of Tamerlane's curse sounds especially relevant. She asks the question, are we not awakening the spirits of war again by our actions? Are we repeating the mistakes of the past? And what would it take to seal these spirits back, to give humanity a chance at peace? The Gurumir mausoleum stands and will stand. The jade sarcophagus remains intact. The ashes of the great conqueror rest in it, surrounded by secrets and legends. And as long as this peace is not disturbed, the world is at least protected from one source of chaos. Let us hope that the lesson of 1941 has been learned, and no one will dare to disturb what must remain untouched. This story teaches us respect for the past, for the dead, for people's traditions and beliefs, even if we don't share them. It teaches us to be cautious in the face of the unknown. And she reminds us that some doors are better kept closed because we don't know what might come out if we open them. The curse of Tamerlane's tomb is more than just a scary story. It is a mirror that reflects our fears, our pride, our desire to control everything, even what is beyond our comprehension. And it is a warning that sometimes science and progress must stop at the threshold beyond which the forbidden begins. To conclude this story, I want to say that to believe or not to believe in a curse is a personal choice of everyone. But facts remain facts. The tomb was opened on June 21st. The war began on the 22nd. The remains were reburied in November, and a counteroffensive began in December. Coincidence? It's possible. Bloody hell? Who knows? But one thing is certain. This is one of the most chilling stories of the 20th century, which haunts researchers and lovers of mysticism to this day. And the next time you pass by an old cemetery or an ancient temple or a mysterious mausoleum, remember this story. Remember that some places keep secrets for a reason, that the warnings of the ancients do not exist for the sake of rhetoric, and that sometimes the best thing we can do is just walk by with our heads bowed respectfully and leave the past alone. Thank you for being with us today on the Fear Files channel.